and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on how to collect real-world data and provide evidence to key regulatory bodies. So, for example, FDA notified bodies for medical devices and the MHRA, etc. So on the agenda, we'll be going through some of the basics, the fundamentals. So with regards to what real-world data is, we'll then look at the different sources and how they're applied. We'll go through an overview of some of the best practices, so contextualize as well within what the key regulatory bodies have recommended. And we'll be looking at the importance of real-world data for regulatory submissions across different stakeholders in the life sciences. And we'll also be looking at the value add. So just quickly before we proceed, we'll start off with a brief introduction. So I'll quickly introduce myself. My name's Obertunisia, Nez for short. I'm the R&D lead here specifically for ECOA and clinical trials. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And I'll just take you through a quick corporate profile on Eclevar and Milo Healthcare. So Eclevar was founded in 2018. So we're a CRO and we specialize in helping stakeholders, particularly medical device stakeholders, navigate some of the key changes that have been made with regards to the MDD being moved to the MDR and helping them generate sufficient evidence in order to get their products to market, but also we facilitate the post-market studies as well. We're an international organization, so headquartered out in France and Paris, but we also have bases here in the UK, Germany and Japan. So some of the therapeutic areas we've worked across are therapy areas such as chronic wound care, urology, and we're also looking to expand into ophthalmology and other therapy areas as well. And just quickly on the software side of things, so as I mentioned, we are a full service CRO, but we also have a software platform called Milo, so Medical Interface Liaison Officer, which is a cloud-based decentralized clinical trials platform, which essentially helps our clients to generate real-world data and subsequently real-world evidence. So facilitates decentralized clinical trial models for evidence generation. And this includes things such as ePro, ECRF, and many other parameters of interest. So according to the requirements of a given study, we'll configure the platform as needed. So just a bit about the team. So the CEO is Shems Hashani. So he's led over 50 global clinical trials, and he sets the strategic direction for the company. And then this is just an overview of the leadership team. So covering clinical trials, software development, and biostatistics, and also the medical communication side of things, specifically medical writing, which of course will encompass CEP, CER, SOTAs, and things of that nature. Here's an overview of some of the clients that we've worked with to date and some of our clinical trial sites as well. So predominantly in France, but again, we have ongoing conversations with clinical sites all over the world. So just to start here, what is real-world data? So with real-world data, we're specifically referring to data that's collected out of a conventional clinical trial setup that's controlled. So if you think about conventional randomized clinical trials, we're looking at data that is aggregated in a real world context, so outside of the clinic. And so just to quote an FDA definition here, data related to patient health status and the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. And we've listed some of these sources below. So for example, we're looking at electronic health records, so usually housed within hospitals and clinical centres, claims and billing activities as well, products and disease registries, also patient-generated data, so for example, patient-reported outcomes, and then data gathered from hardware, software platforms such as mobile devices. So here we'll be usually talking about mobile apps that can collect data on ePro, medication adherence, a personalized diary, data required for any given study. So just to quickly go through the types of real-world data and their applications. So as mentioned, electronic health records. So these can appear in the form of diagnostic codes, medication lists, etc. In terms of the applications, so we're looking at assessing treatment patterns, outcomes, and of course it has a lot of utility in epidemiological analyses as well. And just to follow on from that, this applies particularly for claims data as well. So again, we're looking at things such as procedure codes, pharmacy claims, etc. Again, this is poignant for health economic analyses and healthcare utilization, patient registries. So again, we're looking at platforms or data organized in a way that can capture the natural history of a disease. Such forms of real data are particularly important for rare disease or any disease where the pathophysiology isn't that well understood. So again, the key benefits are the ability to track long-term outcomes and identifying the disease. So it's almost like you can think of it as learning about the disease in real time. And to quickly touch upon wearable devices, so we're talking about hardware, usually paired with an app of some sort on a smartphone. So they tend to cover physiological metrics such as heart rate, pulse oximetry, etc. And again, the ability to monitor patient vitals in real time is incredibly important. And this way we can map out pathophysiological trajectory or the efficacy of treatments. And then patient-reported outcomes. So these are outcomes which are provided by the patients themselves directly, and usually in the form of some type of quality of life survey. It can also be symptom diaries or disease-specific questionnaires. And the importance of this, of course, is to understand the patient's experience and to have a patient-centric view of the clinical study. So just to quickly touch upon the fundamentals for collecting real-world data. So firstly, it's important, it's pivotal to have a clear strategy on how the data will be collected. So of course, it's important to define the specific research objectives, so having a clearly defined question, and then from there, looking at the outcomes and endpoints of interest, those that will be relevant and capture the best possible data. And then following on from that, we're looking at identifying appropriate data sources. So here to use, for example, patient-reported outcomes, you can't just use any type of patient-reported outcome. You'd want to look at the validity. So specifically, you'd want to review the psychometric fundamentals and ensure that the outcome measure is fit for purpose and will collect accurate data. And then we can also extrapolate that and look at the type of hardware platform or software platform being used to ensure that it's fit for purpose and can collect data in an accurate, safe, and regulatory compliant way. and of course establishing timelines and allocating resources appropriately. So this is to ensure that for the operational efficiency of the study. And here we're looking at, secondly, implementing robust data governance and quality control. So it's important to have standardized data definitions. And then secondly, implementing automated quality checks. So usually these will be in line with the ISO standards required. And of course, and thirdly, this provides a nice clear audit trail for the regulatory bodies to follow if and when they need to inspect any given study. And connected to that point, thirdly, ensuring data privacy and security compliance is particularly important when we have multifaceted, large, complex data sets. So again, it's important that the objectives for the study are defined, but then also ensuring that the data collected is collected in a compliant way. So for example, we can refer to HIPAA standards and of course ISO standards as well. But fourthly, so validating data sources and collection methods. So here, this would be just before the initiation phase or deploying the study. We'd want to ensure that the platform is operating as needed. So you can think of things such as user adaptive testing and things of that nature. So this would involve an internal thorough test, but also external validation tests as well. So just to go back to the point on user adaptive testing, we can look at conducting focus groups with patients who may be onboarded onto the study and use it as an opportunity to gather qualitative data on the usability of the platform that will be used to gather real-world data. And then number 5, so standardized data models and terminologies. So again, this is connected to interoperability. We want to ensure that the data is produced, collated in a way that is identifiable and usable as per the regulatory standards which will be followed. So we have some of the common vocabularies used, such as SNOMED, also HL7 and FHIR, which is quite commonly used, so the fast healthcare interoperability resource model. So just to delve a bit deeper into standardized data models. So this is particularly important for ensuring, again, quality, consistency, and the interoperability of real-world data. So it's important that the data is collected and stored in a consistent way. This makes analysis and generating the real-world evidence following on from the aggregation of real-world data a lot easier. So interoperability, we want to make sure the systems are talking to each other. So for example, if we're using a DCT platform, if and when it needs to interact or interface with the EHR records in a given hospital where they're recruiting from, if this isn't done easily, this can of course drive up project costs. It can stall processes, but also there may be some key real-world data insights which may not be passed on in the process to then be analyzed and to generate important real-world evidence insights. So interoperability is key here. So having an appropriate API in place. And of course, data quality and efficient analysis. So consistent data and interoperable models will allow for high quality and efficient processes in order to ensure that the regulatory requirements are met or increase the likelihood of the regulatory requirements being met. So here we're just going to present a case study, so specifically related to a medical device that we were generating real-world evidence for. So this was a retrospective observational multi-center real-world evidence study. The notified body was GMED in this case. And the key objective was to generate real-world evidence on the safety and performance of a vascular patch. So the source of real-world data in this case was a medical chart, and so real-world based on real-world clinical practice data. So as a retrospective study, we did go through those records in order to analyze it based on what was collated in the real-world context. Time frame, so this was up to 3 years post-surgery. So here we were looking at the long-term real-world outcomes. The sample size was 198 patients, and we had between 3 to 8 different sites. In terms of the specifics regarding the patient population, so there were a minimum of 100 subjects, each with carotid or femoral locations, so around the neck and the thigh area. So the primary real-world outcome in this case was real-world retinosis rates within 1 year. So here we're looking at specifically the recurrence of the narrowing of the blood vessel or heart valve, so specifically after it's been treated. And then the secondary real-world evidence outcomes were the procedural success rates, the real-world rates of target artery retinosis and reintervention, then of course incidence of stroke, transient ischemic attack, myocardial infarction in routine practice, real-world mortality, so specifically related to cardiovascular incidences and also all causes, and then any other pathophysiological complication that was observed in clinical practice. And so this study was carried out successfully. We did generate the evidence required, but this is just a good example to look at the type of real-world data, how it can be applied within the context of medical devices. And just to highlight as well, the evidence may not always be directly derived from, let's say, for example, a wearable device. I know wearable devices tend to get a lot of attention with regards to real-world data, real-world evidence analyses, but it can also be derived from a more retrospective source where we're going back to review real-world data that's been collated in order to generate new real-world evidence insights. And just to follow on from that, so going forward, and just to touch upon the Milo platform that I mentioned earlier, we do, again, in line with the push for digitization, and of course, within the increase in applications of AI, going forward, we are looking at generating real world evidence with this platform specifically. And as mentioned, it has the capability of drawing real world data from multiple sources in order to create a multifaceted data set. So for example, it has the capability in this case of drawing data from the electronic health record and combining that, triangulating the data with any data that is being aggregated in the form of PROs or any other outcomes of interest which are being collated in the study. So you can think of a dashboard with a multifaceted data set, which will also include the data relayed from the hospital itself post API integration. So this provides a more efficient and granular way of generating real world data and subsequently real world evidence. So this doesn't only apply to medical devices. This of course can apply to more drug development applications as well. And just to quickly touch upon this, again, just touching upon the point of triangulating data, the data collated can also involve data related to the feasibility of a given site, and of course, combined with the real-world evidence insights generated and the material vigilance as well for the medical devices. And just before I quickly move on, if there are any, we'll be carrying out some demos and also free use of the platform between the start and middle of October. So between the 2nd to the 16th of October, if there's anyone that's interested specifically in the application of this technology, if you make a comment in the Q&A box, one of my colleagues will follow up with you about additional details. And also, we do have 5 other similar case studies which we can provide more information on if you're interested. So in terms of what does the current regulatory landscape for real-world data look like? So regulatory bodies are increasingly acknowledging the importance of real-world data. So there are some clear examples that we can point to. So for example, the FDA's real-world evidence program, which aims to incorporate real-world data into regulatory decisions. We also have the EMA, so the European Medicines Agency, who have issued guidance on the use of registry-based studies for regulatory purposes. And then the MHRA, who emphasize the importance and the potential of real-world data for improving the efficiency of drug development and processes and medicine reimbursement specifically. So to start off with notified bodies, so medical devices, we can take a look at the publication from last year from the FDA. So this was entitled Use of Real-World Evidence to Support Regulatory Decision-Making for Medical Devices. So here we've looked at some of the key take-home points from this publication. So again, there's a clear emphasis on the clear study design. So as I mentioned earlier, it's important to have a thoroughly designed study in order to ensure that the data collected is as relevant, is as specific as possible. So for example, within the context of medical devices, we'd be looking at the study population. We'll be looking at the specific medical devices and any potential comparators. All of these things need to be clearly outlined before even starting on the processes for aggregating the real world data specifically. And then secondly, we look at data quality, which is a recurrent theme across a lot of these publications and guidelines. So ensuring that the statistical power is sufficient, and also validation studies. So in this case, and if economically feasible and if in line with timelines, it would be a good idea to carry out a validation study. So in this case, to ensure that the real world data generated is coherent and is relevant and will serve the purpose that it's meant to serve. So this could be in the form of a smaller internal observational study before rolling out a fuller study across multiple centres. And just to follow on, justification of real world evidence. So again, it's not just a case of collating real world data. In order to generate real world evidence, it needs to be justified. And one way of doing this is to ensure that the outcomes of interest and the endpoints are chosen carefully, and any which rely upon real world data aggregation, they're as robust as possible, so the justification is clearly outlined in any regulatory submissions. So for example, to go back to the point of any eCOA or ePro tools, whether they're used within the context of medical devices or in pharma generally, you'd want to outline the psychometric parameters of those ePros, showing that they're fit for purpose, that the mathematical properties will ensure that the data generated is valid and can support any regulatory decision making. And just to further contextualize things within medical devices, so we have the EU MDR, so specifically Article 83. So I quote, "The post-market surveillance system shall be suited to actively and systematically gathering, recording, and analyzing relevant data on the quality, performance, and safety of a device throughout its lifetime." So although real-world data is not specifically referenced here, real-world data, of course, can help achieve what's stated here in this article, due to the ability to collect data on a longitudinal basis and the granular insights which can be garnered from the application of real-world data to generate real-world evidence. This, of course, can provide quite a thorough profile on the efficacy and safety of a medical device. There was also the clinical evaluation under EU MDR, publication by the BSI, quite a brief one where they acknowledge the importance of real-world data. So across the board, across multiple regulatory bodies, there is the increase in acknowledgement of real-world data as a source to support regulatory submissions and decision making. So just to quickly go on to the FDA. So the FDA is a leader in this field in terms of providing guidance. So there are many publications or guidelines that they've produced so over the past year few years. So just to quickly whiz through some of them. So there was the framework for the FDA's Real World Evidence Program, so published in 2018. So here they recognize the potential of real world data and evidence to support regulatory decisions, specifically about drug effectiveness. And then also stating that real world evidence will be appraised against the validity of the real world data. So whatever real world evidence is produced, they will go back to the source of that real world evidence. So again, everything points back to the robustness of the study design, and any real world data that is gathered, it needs to be justified and also fit for purpose. And then the completeness and relevance of outcomes are key. Again, this is related to data quality. And if we think about some specific use cases of real world data, so say, for example, if we have a longitudinal study with patients who need to provide data and medication adherence or any other parameter, maybe they need to fill out a pro on a mobile phone, it will be important for them to adhere as closely as possible to the protocol to ensure that the data is as complete as possible. And of course, relevance of outcomes, this is particularly important, again, within the context of real world data where patients have a lot more autonomy. So aside from having a thoroughly well-designed protocol where patients are inputting data themselves, they will need to have, so following informed consent, it's important that they have a really good understanding of what's required of them so that the data produced by them is useful. And then again, interoperability is important for efficient flow and exchange of data. So this is another publication, and this one is related to considerations for the use of real-world data and real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for drug and biological products. So here they acknowledge that observational studies do not require investigational new drug application. So this is because in this case, usually for observational studies, they don't involve administering an investigational drug or changing, the purpose isn't to change patient care to routine clinical practice. We're simply gathering data from a real world context in order to contribute towards the already existing, or if not existing, a new evidence base. And then transparency of study protocol. So again, this is related to data quality. And there's something else as well that is